I was writing a third volume of nuclear history about the last years of the Cold War. And among the other parts of that story was the story of the Reykjavik summit. So when I saw the transcripts from the summit that are always kept in these formal events, they just looked like a play. Reagan and Gorbachev sitting in a room. And it made sense to see if I could turn that into a play. Most of the transcripts were simply Gorbachev and Reagan. They would turn to their advisors, but they were the ones who were doing the talking. So, but what was intriguing is that the Russian transcripts, which I was able to get a copy of and have translated, included statements by both parties that had been left out of the American transcript. Reagan's people did not want him to give anything away at Reykjavik. And they thought he was a semi-senile old man, which he was not. He was a very keen negotiator at Reykjavik. So when the transcripts, which are after all supposed to be the factual draft of what happened, were produced, they were missing the things Reagan said that indicated he was prepared to make a deal to eliminate nuclear weapons. A huge event. Yeah. And fortunately, since the Russian record keeper was afraid to leave anything out in the Soviet style, it was all there in the Soviet side. So it made really a much more dramatic story than, of course, the neutered transcript that the Americans produced had. I had never written a play before, but I was at a point in my career as a writer where I was fascinated with trying new forms. So when I saw that the Reykjavik story broke out so beautifully into a drama, I read about 100 modern plays that I bought from the Dramatist Workshop or whatever that agency is, and got a sense of the form. And because Richard Pearl, who was a really sinister figure in this whole story, was so Iago-like, I went back and reread Othello. And it was the same story, basically. But I thought everybody needed to be in the play, and I even added the ghost of Robert Oppenheimer, the great scientist who had run the bomb program in Los Alamos. And not surprisingly, whenever Oppenheimer walked on stage, he just took over the play. Right. So the other piece of this story is that when I was thinking about all this, Paul Newman was a friend of mine. I'd met him when he played the role of General Groves in a movie. And I talked to him about it and said, I'd love to turn this into a play, but I can't really afford it. I've got to write books for a living. And he picked up what was not intended to be a cue and made some magic in the background with a couple of foundations, and suddenly I had the money to work on the play. But he very quickly saw that this was not a play that needed 9 characters, particularly if Oppenheimer was going to fill the room. And he suggested I cut it back. So in the early drafts, all the characters were there, including Richard Pearl. But once I started working with a director who also felt that the play needed to be focused on the 2 main characters, then I went back and got rid of everybody else. This left George Shultz, the Secretary of State, I think a little unhappy because he kind of put the play down for several years afterwards. I live in California near Stanford where he's based, so. He said it's not true to history, which is true, it's not. But much of it is. Fat Man and Little Boy was the movie that he was in. He called me up because he was reading my book, Making the Atomic Bomb, and wanted to talk about the character. So we were living in Connecticut at the time, and my wife and I drove down to New York and had dinner with him. He seemed a little bit shy with me that first time around, so he spent the whole evening looking in Ginger's eyes. She was absolutely delighted. Those lovely blue eyes of Paul's. But we got to know each other a bit after that. He was a lovely, lovely man, of course. I think everyone who's ever known him knows that. Absolutely. Yeah. There was a reading in New York for the United Nations, and that was, I think, the first time it was seen on the East Coast. It's had many readings around the country. Janet Nypris, who was the director of the playwriting department at NYU and is a playwright herself and is a friend, told me once, Dick, you can have readings for the rest of your life with plays. I didn't know if it was ever going to see a production. There was a 2-night production at Stanford a few years ago, but this will be the first time the play will really be on stage with full production. So in that sense, I think it's very exciting. Well, I was working at that point with Tyler Marchant. Tyler had produced the off-Broadway production of Freud's Last Session, which was the 2-man play. And I think he saw this as the possible play that might replace it eventually. It has a little bit of technical material in it, necessarily. These 2 men were talking about intercontinental ballistic missiles, medium-range missiles, nuclear weapons, and I think that may have put Tyler off a bit. But in any case, I can't think of a better audience for the play than a Washington audience. They're more familiar with some of these things. I looked at A Walk in the Woods, which was, of course, a very successful play, and was stunned by how little actual discussion of the technical details of that particular meeting actually had survived in the play. But understandably, people don't know these things. They don't have to know these things. I have been surprised and shocked by how few Americans still believe we actually have nuclear weapons. There's an annual survey of what most frightens people. And during the Cold War, number 1 or number 2 was typically nuclear war. Today, nuclear war is down around number 25 or 30. People are much more afraid of people crossing the border or of crime in the streets. But the nuclear weapons are still there. They're still a risk to the world, maybe more so than ever because they're so forgotten. And the power, I think, of this story, what drew me to it so much, was that these 2 men, and these 2 men uniquely, sat down and came within an inch of agreeing to begin eliminating all the nuclear weapons in the world. So the question in my mind for the play was, why these 2? How could they have stepped so far ahead of the rest of both of their leaderships? Why did it fail? Well, I mean, in a sense, it didn't fail because you could certainly argue that the Reykjavik summit was the beginning of the end of the Cold War. I mean, there are a number of possible beginnings of ends, but this is certainly one of them. What intrigued me then was to look into the character of Gorbachev and Reagan and ask, what do they have that's different from the people who work with them? And the answer in both cases quickly became clear. They were both outsiders. They were not part of the city slicker crowd that typically occupies the high levels of in national security. Reagan was a small town boy who had been a sportscaster and an athlete. He was a lifeguard during his adolescent years. Reagan had been an actor and had played a lot of roles around the edges of military issues. He'd been a union executive in the Hollywood Actors Union and had fought off some communist infiltration of his own union. So that's where he came with this unusual outsider view. And Gorbachev, equally intriguing, Gorbachev went to the best university in the Soviet Union, Moscow University, on a 4-year, all-expenses-paid scholarship for having harvested more wheat as a 17-year-old than any other teenage boy in the entire Soviet Union. Gorbachev used to say he was prouder of his Stalin Medal for that wheat harvest than any other thing he ever won. So when he worked his way up and entered the Politburo, it was as Secretary of Agriculture. And he was keenly aware, having grown up on a collective farm, that the people of rural Soviet Union in particular were really falling behind. In fact, the country couldn't even grow enough grain to feed its own people, even though it's a rich and bounteous country. So Gorbachev was looking for a way to cut the budget of all this other stuff, and the obvious place to start was nuclear weapons. So he came in from an angle too, and it's because of their unique backgrounds, I think, and the kind of people it shaped them to be, that they became so engaged in what was way off base as far as the whole agenda was concerned. And I think that makes for real drama in the play. The actress Diane Kruger has, with the help of the Sloan Foundation, rather along the same lines as Sloan's support in the development of the movie Hidden Figures, has been working toward a multi-part television series. And the key piece of input finally was support from Google. They're going to fund the multi-part series. So we have Hetty, and we have the funding, and the script is now being written while Diane has a baby. And I think they'll come out about the same time, so she should be ready to move on to that. Yeah. Doran Weber, the vice president at the Sloan Foundation, who has helped through Sloan support my books for a number of years, has been working on the Hetty project for a long time, and I think it's now going to see fruition. Yeah. And you know, the partial support for my writing the play, came from the MacArthur Foundation. Several MacArthur presidents ago, so I don't know if they'd be interested, but they actually put a stage reading on in Chicago right after in fact, of the earlier version of the play. So they supported to that extent. In the course of trying to move the play from the transcript of a summit meeting to a work of drama, I looked at other writings of both men. And among other things, I found a letter that Reagan wrote to Nancy while he was at the summit on one of the overnight breaks. And it was so charming that I just put it into a scene by itself and had him read it aloud as he wrote it. And the audience just adores this letter, and it's literally verbatim what he wrote. Just one phrase. It ends with his salutation to his beloved. It says, "Good night, medium-sized muffin." I've yet to see an audience that doesn't just fall down laughing at this charming moment in his life. Well, and people, after all, you don't have years to learn to get to know two people when they're characters in a play. You have to find ways to show their personality, show it forth. And I thought, even though that never happened, it could have happened. I can imagine Gorbachev going along with Reagan in that regard. Gorbachev was a kind of puckish sense of humor and was a very competent, bright man. So if Reagan wanted to teach him to soft shoe, he would have done it. You know, the theater was developed at a time when the only way people could communicate with each other was in physical presence of each other, basically. That's what Shakespeare was. That's what the Globe was. And before that, to reach an audience of thousands and millions in any medium that takes the essence of this kind of work. I was a child living on a farm in Missouri in the 1950s when television came to Kansas City, where I lived in Missouri. The first play I ever saw was Macbeth on the Hallmark Hall of Fame, live. The famous scene where the actor playing Macbeth thought the camera had turned away and got up and walked off the set. But the point is, I was so mesmerized by, even in the crude medium that television was then. And it got me started and interested in the theater and in these ideas and so on. Just to say one other thing about this version of this structure that makes it available to children. There are two crucial moments in the play where Gorbachev reveals his deepest feelings about why he's concerned about destroying the world with nuclear weapons, and another one where Reagan does. Those scenes are taken verbatim from their writings. When Gorbachev talks about the horror of finding dead soldiers on the ground in the Second World War, when Reagan talks about the shock and horror of seeing his father drunk and passed out in the snow and trying to decide whether to drag him inside or not, that's from Reagan's own writing. So you see things that you couldn't necessarily find in the 500 pages of an autobiography. So it's very much worthwhile. You know, to be just a little crude, when I asked that of my mentor, a man named Conrad Knickerbocker, who was a writer and was writing reviews for the New York Times at that point in his life, he looked at me, he was a very funny man, he looked at me and he said, "Rhodes, apply ask to chair." And it's true, writers are people who write. There are lots of people in the world who will tell writers, "I really would like to write." It's writing that makes you a writer. And the world is pretty tough for writers these days. It's hard to make a full-time living, but you don't have to make full-time living to be a writer. You can be a doctor, you can be a lawyer, you can be whatever you want to be and still write. There are many such out there right now. But you have to do it and keep doing it and keep doing it until you learn to do it. And I think then the world will be the path to your door, at least we hope so. You know, I'd always felt that plays, as I saw them on stage, felt a little mechanical. Maybe because I grew up like all of us on movies, and they're more realistic in a lot of ways. But the theater does something so magical. From the point of view of a writer, it's just remarkable to think some words up and put them down on a page and then see real people walking around saying these words. It's like no other experience I've ever had as a writer. From the point of view of writing a play, there's a famous line of Robert Frost where he talks about blank verse versus rhymed verse. All of his writing was rhymed verse. He says, writing blank verse is like playing tennis with the net down. Well, a play has a pretty rigid structure. You know, each act has its shape and the overall form has its shape, and there's a beginning that has to happen fast to get the audience, and there's a break at the moment when the act ends that has to look forward, and it's really quite a rigid structure in a lot of ways, although it has lots of range. But that's a really wonderful exercise. Learning to write in a lot of different ways is part of becoming a good writer. And playwriting is a fascinating form. I'm in the process of negotiating to write a biography of the world's leading specialist on the social ants, Ed Wilson, who is right now in his 89th year, working with people like the singer Paul Simon and others to build a foundation that will preserve what's left of wilderness in the world. Ed calls it his half-Earth project, that about half the world is still left as semi-wilderness or wilderness. He wants to try and save that because, as he says, we can beat global warming, but you really can't beat extinction. When a creature species dies, they're gone. There's no way to bring them back. So a biography of this endlessly interesting and very, very brilliant scientist is going to be my next work, and I'm really looking forward to it. I've got several plays working in my head. Plays are my hobby at this point. I mean, I'm working with a composer on a musical about Chang and Eng, the original Siamese twins. Can you see these two guys singing together in duets? They lived back in the 1830s, and they had a rich and complicated life. They make a wonderful musical. And I'm thinking about a play about Robert Oppenheimer, the guy who ran Manhattan Project down at Los Alamos, who's an endlessly fascinating figure. So I got the bug. There was a night when he left Los Alamos and went up to Berkeley in California to visit an old lover of his who was on the brink of suicide, Jean Tatlock. he broke security rules and all sorts of things. So he spent the night with Jean, even though he'd been married to his wife for a number of years, but she was in extremis and he wanted to help her. There were a couple of gumshoe security agents sitting in a car outside the apartment building in Berkeley. And that seems to me to be a great setting to deal with the large and small problems of life. So that's the setting for the play, but I haven't started it yet. Thank you, my pleasure. Thank you for the reading tonight.